We're not sure if that even occurred. At this point, we don't know what prompted the incident.
Have you been called to the residence before?
No.
Not for domestic violence?
No, sir.
Is there an employment history on Mr. Hance?
We haven't compiled that yet. Preliminary investigation was just done into his criminal background.
What kind of guns used in the shooting, or were there multiple guns?
There were multiple firearms found.
Do you know what type of weapons detected?
Two handguns.
And did he reload or did he use both guns?
That's currently still under investigation. There are 3 different crime scene units that were responsible for the 4 different crime scenes, and they gathered the evidence, and their reports have not been completed yet.
Do you have an idea of how many shots he fired?
No, sir.
How difficult are the logistics of all this make investigating the situation?
Well, at this point, with the cooperation of the agencies that Chief Meyer spelled out for you, it's going along as smooth as can be expected. Once their reports are compiled, then we'll gather all the information into one central location to compile the complete report.
And I apologize if I missed this, but I know the initial reports of possible argument, you're still working on motive, is that what you said?
The reports of the initial calls that came in, where I think that the rumor of the argument stemmed from people screaming and the gravity and the emotion of the situation. People were being pursued by a gunman.
Right now, no motive still.
No motive.
What's the condition of Rebecca in the hospital? What's her condition?
She's at a local hospital, and her condition has not been released yet.
When you said she was shot multiple times, is that correct? Is that the information?
Correct.
And was she the first victim, or did he double back? Do you know the sequence?
As I said before, we're not sure exactly the order in which the victims were shot at the first 2 crime scenes. That is still under investigation.
And we don't know what his anger was towards this other family.
We have no idea what prompted this incident whatsoever.
Do you know what the 11-year-old was doing there? I understand from that state.
Rebecca Dieter's brother, Craig Dieter, was visiting from Kentucky. He and his wife and Scott. Scott was Craig's son, or Rebecca's nephew.
Detective, can you tell us anything additionally about Mr. Hance, about his occupation, anything about him aside from his relationship?
Because of this incident just occurred yesterday in the scope of the investigation, all we've looked into at this point is his criminal history. And all we know right now is he has no arrest record.
Is there one victim at the hospital? Some of us last night were saying there may be 2 victims but only 1 shot. Was someone else hurt who was not shot?
Someone was transported with a panic attack from the neighborhood, and that person has since been released.
Is that a relative?
It was a relative of one of the gunshot victims, yes.
And do you know, I know you're piecing it together, forgive us, but how long after that second 911 call we heard, how long afterwards were your officers engaging the suspect? Do you know the time frame here?
The 911 call, the last one that you heard, was made as he was making entry into the house pursuing Scott. So we're guessing a matter of minutes. I don't have those exact numbers with me. But as he was exiting that residence is when he was engaged by police.
And how long did he chase distance-wise that man, and how long distance-wise did he chase that boy?
Well, if we can go back to the map. If you can look right about here is where we believe that he engaged Brian Johnson, and from that location to where Brian's body was found is probably about 500 yards.
That was the chase of the man?
That's where he chased Brian down, correct.
How long was the chase of the boy?
From witness accounts, we believe as he crossed Chocolog Road returning back toward the crime scene, Scott crossed Chocolog Road from the other direction, still fleeing from the initial crime scene, and he saw him and then pursued him from there. So we're not sure exactly how far it was, but he re-engaged the last victim relatively close to 1219.
Can you give us any information again about when your officers confronted him and the description of what happened?
That would be the...
Yeah, just to clarify that a little bit, the initial call was received at about 10:56 a.m. Our dispatch center received notification at about 11:06 a.m. that the suspect had been shot. So that'll give you some indication as to the time frame. Now, I don't know that when the suspect was shot, a call was immediately made in. There may have been some period of time where the officer had to approach the suspect to make certain everything was safe before he was able to make a call. But to give you some indication, that would also give you an indication that from the time we received the call till the time it was over with, that pretty much spans this whole incident. It's clear from when we look at this that the incident was such that this suspect was moving about this neighborhood and moving rather rapidly. And so initially there wasn't a clear indication as to where the suspect could be located until our officer was able to get some information from a resident in the neighborhood as well as the calls that came into the dispatch center that were starting to pinpoint him. Also, additionally, I would like to say that when we broke this thing up into 4 different crime scenes, as I said, we broke it up at the 4 different residences, as you see there. Your question as to how difficult this was, as you can expect, an incident of this magnitude and this nature is not easy to deal with, but we dealt with it like we deal with all crime scenes. Very methodical. We have things that we do and reasons why we do them. And the biggest thing was coordinating all these efforts. Obviously, the most important thing was to get to this suspect and render the neighborhood safe. And then after that was to coordinate the efforts of all these agencies that were kind enough to help us, because it was an awful lot of work in terms of processing the crime scene. And that's why each of these crime scenes, so to speak, as we broke it up into 4 different scenes, were processed by different agencies so that each one could be processed at the same time by different agencies to get this work done. The last one, which is 1219 Shocolog, I asked the Summit County Sheriff's Department to process that crime scene, in part because that's where it ended, and that's where the officer engaged the suspect in gunfire. So the Summit County Sheriff's Office is actively investigating that part of it, not only for what took place there on the part of the suspect, but also with regard to the use of force of our officer. So they will be handling that part of the investigation and then ultimately consulting with the Summit County Prosecutor's Office on that.
Can you tell us what steps your officer did when he did confront Mr. Hansen and what happened there?
We're not going to go into a lot of detail because I don't necessarily have all the details. He still has not been interviewed yet. That should take place later today. But essentially what I believe took place is that the officer learned that the suspect was in the general vicinity of 1219 Shocolog, again, through the 911 calls and through a person in the neighborhood that directed the officer to that location. Once he realized where that suspect was, he went directly to that area, obviously had to start searching to see if he could locate him, and he did see him. This is a treed neighborhood, obviously. There's a lot of trees, there's a lot of structures. He had to use some caution as he entered that area and did see the suspect. He, I believe, uttered some verbal commands telling the suspect to drop his weapon. The suspect did not do so, and I think that he made movements in the nature that caused the officer to believe that he was in danger. And obviously at that point in time, we weren't going to waste too much time in dealing with this. We had to stop the situation as quick as we did.
Did both your officer and the retired officer shoot him? Do you know who were both?
It's my understanding that as this took place, both our officer fired at the suspect and the person who formerly served as a police officer fired at the suspect. However, the early indication we have, and I can't say that that's totally verified at this point, but the early indication that we have from the Summit County Medical Examiner's office is that the suspect was struck by gunfire from our officer and not the citizen.
Have police ever been called out to the location where the suspect lived before?
To clarify a little bit, we believe the suspect actually was kind of living at 2 locations. The suspect maintained an address in Akron, but it's our belief that the suspect was living at 2389 Goodenough with his girlfriend for some period of time. I don't know that we know exactly how long. Again, from what we've done so far, we don't believe we were ever called to that location for any type of incident involving this suspect.
How about at the Akron address, Chief?
The Akron address, I don't know, but I do know that as all the officers that have been investigating this from all the agencies, the suspect has very little background. I think there might have been a couple times when he's had contact with police departments, but as far as we can determine, he has no arrest record. And like anybody, there's been some contact, but I don't think there's been anything serious, and obviously nothing of this nature. And obviously, checking record databases in several communities can sometimes take some time, so we're still kind of doing that.
Can you talk about your officer who actually confronted the suspect, and he, obviously everybody, he probably saved some more lives, don't you think?
I believe he did.
Chief, could you clarify something for me? Scott ran into the house at 1219 Chocolate trying to seek refuge from the shooter?
Yes, again, just to kind of recap, I think you all are clear that it started on Goodenough between those two locations, either 2389 and 2401 Goodenough. And again, as time goes on, we're not sure exactly which address everything started because they're both immediately adjacent to each other. Something happened there. That's where everything happened between the two addresses. Then the suspect chased a couple individuals north on that dotted yellow line toward 1178 Chocolat. We believe somewhere between the initial location and 1178 Chocolat that the individuals the shooter was chasing kind of split up, and this 11-year-old Scott somehow was veering more toward Chocolat, but the shooter followed Brian Johnson, I believe, to 1178, but then returned and came back south looking for whoever. We don't know whoever, but we believe he realized that Scott had gone into the home at 1219. So we're thinking he saw Scott go into that home, and he went into that home, and obviously we believe he shot Scott there. We're also learning there were some other folks in that home that apparently he made no effort to harm in any way, shape, or form. So that's one of the puzzles here, is why was he going after the child? But that's something that we're trying to determine as time goes on.
Was there a dog killed as well? Was there a dog killed?
Okay, hold on. Somebody said, was there a dog killed? Not to my knowledge. There were a couple dogs on the loose in the neighborhood and that.
Do you know if the people who were in the basement of that home of 1219 were aware that Scott had come into the house, or if they let him in, what the circumstances?
I believe.
It was the second 911 call that we played was the individual that was in the basement with her 3 children.
Do they know Scott was in their house?
She let him in to give him refuge.
But they ended up in the basement?
Correct. They went to the basement and hid.
Was Scott in the basement with them?
Correct.
So he gets into the basement and shoots Scott in the basement
Correct.
in front of the other individuals?
At that point, she left the basement. She left the basement with her children, and Scott was left in the basement alone.
He didn't try to harm them?
No.
Try to shoot them, just let them go?
Yes.
And then went outside.
At that point, it appears that he allowed them to go, and he went outside, and sometime shortly thereafter is when our officers found him there.
Is there reason to believe that Brian Johnson was wounded already during the 500 yards he was chased?
That was the responsibility of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. They processed that crime scene. I couldn't give you that information. The distance that he ran, I would say it's highly unlikely that he was wounded to run that far.
Chief, can you talk about your normal staffing on Sunday morning?
Normally, I can't tell you what we had yesterday, but we normally would have 3 or 4 officers working at a time on a Sunday morning.
Individual cars?
Yes, it's individual cars.
Do you know the connection between those named neighbors and the Johnson family and Rebecca, and any particular reason you might be targeting them, like potential witnesses, or theorizing he was trying to shoot?
I think so far there's just been brief statements folks have made, nothing material to give us a concrete indication as why. We do know the 2 families knew each other because they lived next door to each other, so we do know that much.
Did the suspect have a concealed carry license, or did any idea where these guns came from? And did he run through the neighborhood with all the guns?
I'm not aware that he had a concealed carry license. I don't think he did, but again, that's something I can't necessarily speak to. No real indication as to where he got the guns other than we believe that they were his guns and he brought them with him and had them at that home.
And there were only 2 firearms that we
And
recovered.
one of the things that we will do in the aftermath, obviously there are a lot of tasks that we still have ahead of us in terms of continuing to investigate and try to find out if we can determine a motive. But one of the things that we normally would do and are doing now is we seek the assistance of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that will attempt to trace the firearms and see if we can figure out who the owner of those firearms is, if there's somebody else.
Chief, just to clarify, we don't, if I hear this right, we don't know if his girlfriend was shot first or if she was shot later in the scene?
That is correct. I think at the beginning there was some indication she may have been shot first, but after we're able to take the time and go through calls and the more folks we talk to, we cannot say for sure who was shot first.
And your officer was there at 11:06. What time did the second 911 call come?
I don't know offhand. I mean, we can, essentially these 911 calls all came in one right after the other. So I can't tell you, I mean, we can tell you exactly if we sit down and look at it, but they were all very close to one another.
We know if Hans actually returned fire.
No, we don't. That's something we'll find out. I do not think he did, but I can't tell you for sure.
What about the folks at 1219? Did they talk to you at all about whether or not Mr. Hans said anything to them?
I would have to ask the
That's
detective.
still currently under investigation. Our preliminary interview was done on scene, but we have to do a follow-up interview to get more particular information from those individuals.
Detective, the three people at 1219, a mother and two children, ages, am I right about that?
There was a mother and 3 children and her mother's boyfriend in the house at the time.
And all of them were allowed to leave, and then is that the belief that he shot this 11-year-old boy?
Yes.
How long did the suspect live in the neighborhood? How long did you see them live in the neighborhood?
The residence where they lived was Rebecca's mother's house, and she passed away recently within the last year, and they moved into the house after she passed away. So we're guessing between 8 and 9 months, and again, that's just a guess at this point.